Hello and welcome to How I Hire, the podcast where today's top executives share stories of their leadership journey, including defining moments that tested their values, sharpened their judgment, and shaped how they build teams and lead with purpose. I'm Roy Nodowitz, founder and CEO of Noda Group Executive Search. You can learn more about us at nodagroup.com. As a trusted partner to mission and values-driven consumer brands, we've had the privilege of working alongside some of the world's most inspiring operators as they've tackled the challenge of building high-performance leadership teams. In this podcast, we spark a conversation about how to achieve success in hiring and create purposeful leadership for the next generation of companies. Helayna Minsk is a seasoned executive leader whose work has spanned global markets, massive transformation, and large-scale revitalization initiatives. She's worked with major brands like Johnson & Johnson, Walgreens, and Unilever, and her roles have included oversight of global branding, marketing, and also P&L, all unified by a laser focus on growth, value, and innovation. She joins me on the podcast to discuss building teams through consumer change, the value of cross-functionality, the core competencies she seeks in her leadership teams, and much more. Helayna, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Let's dive right in. Interested in having you take us back to the beginning and talk about what initially sparked your interest in the industry and how that evolved into the career that you've built.
So I started out as a politics major, and after working on campaigns and interning at the Democratic National Committee, my interest was really less in policy and more in why people vote the way they do. So the cues of appearance and language and how they show up and communicate. And when I shared that with my mother, who was not a business person but was very astute, she pointed out that what I was describing was a lot like market research and marketing. And so I started to explore psychology and economics, and I found through my studies in statistics and an internship at an ad agency one summer that while those were critical elements of what I was interested in, each was just one aspect. And it was an internship at the old Nabisco when I was in business school that really solidified for me that what I liked was that holistic approach and the ownership and the business as well as the marketing side of brand management. And I really just find consumers and customers and brands endlessly fascinating. And that has really proven itself out over my career.
Oh, that's really great. And so you were fortunate that you got on the highway going the right direction starting out instead of maybe having to shift 5 or 10 years in.
I am always amazed that, in fact, with very little information, it turned out to be the right decision for an entire career. Yeah.
So when you reflect on your leadership journey and the work that you've done developing leaders around you, what core beliefs or values or guiding truths or principles have become part of your playbook?
First and foremost would be integrity and fair play. Warren Buffett says you should look for three qualities when you hire people: integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if they don't have the first, then the other two will kill you. So I just think that personally and professionally, you have to be honest and reliable and trustworthy. Second of all, I think to lead people, you need to balance confidence and humility. So sometimes that means faking it till you make it, even as you continue to learn from others and on the job. And I think that others perform better when they feel confident. So I think that as a leader, you should let them know that you believe in them and celebrate and amplify their successes. And I think you show that belief when you empower them and aren't too prescriptive. So third, I think, is giving a clear brief and letting people run with it. I'm always blown away when people come back and they feel ownership and pride over their solution and they come up with things that I never would have thought of on my own. I just think it's incredible. I feel pride for them and just great joy when that happens. I believe in servant leadership, both in supporting your team and trying to serve those who you partner with. I remember years ago, I worked with an agency guy, and no matter what the feedback he got from the client, and I'm sure that he was probably rolling his eyes through the phone sometimes, he wouldn't say no. He'd always say, let me take it back to the team and let us look at it, which gave them space to formulate either a defense for their plan or to make modifications in a way that worked for everyone. I believe in a lot of communication and in different forms, whether that's one-on-one, small groups, big groups like town halls, and forms, both written and verbal. really as much as possible, especially when you're in the midst of a transformation, because people want to know what's going on in their organization, especially if it's going to affect them. And as leaders, I think we have to find the balance between what's confidential and not ready to be shared, but also letting people feel as if they can contribute and have some control over what's happening around them.
So, as it relates to your beliefs and your experiences that you had, kind of formative years of your career, call it the first 10 to 15 years, were there mentors or moments that really shaped this leadership philosophy or approach or your beliefs around that?
I have been fortunate that I've had mentors along the way, several of whom shaped my leadership either by example, modeling how they worked with their people. So, for example, I worked with somebody, he was senior to me, and I didn't work for him. But from him, I really looked at how he cared for his people as humans from the way that he used performance review time, not just to talk about that period's performance, but about long term ambitions. And in some cases, even their personal goals, and start helping them plan backwards towards achieving them. I've also gotten some great advice. So before I was seconded to China, the gentleman who sent me, Jesse Wu, told me that all sorts of people would be vying for my time once I got there, but that I should prioritize meeting everyone that I could on the China team first. And I did. So the company had set up orientations with each member of the executive leadership team, as well as my direct reports. But I really took his advice to heart and made it a point to meet really every single person on my team down to the administrative assistants. And it's something that I've done on every role since because it's been enormously helpful. Usually I'm brought in when growth is stalled. We need the right strategy and the right organization to get it back on track. And so I start by asking people, what are we doing well? What do we need to get better at? What do you hope I'll do? What are you afraid I'll do? And what advice would you give me? And it's so interesting what people come back with. Some people are very straightforward and they tell me exactly what they would do if they were in my shoes to get a company back on track. Some of them bring in pictures of their family and talk with me about their ambitions for their personal lives and their families. And you really do see where the energy is. You see where there's consensus, you see where there's not, you see where the early wins might be, and everybody feels heard. And because I also believe in communication, especially when you're new and you're leading a transformation and people are wondering what you're going to do next, sharing out that collective summary of what you're hearing and how you plan to use it really is just an immediate way to build trust. And honestly, I have found it so well received and I've gotten so much out of it that I have started doing it annually when I've gone to companies.
That's awesome. So, if you were to take us through your career path, can you explain a little bit more about how your leadership developed and evolved as you took on increasingly larger or wide-ranging roles, whether it was at Unilever, J&J, or Walgreens?
I think the one thing that I have learned over time is that strategy alone is never going to change the performance of a company or an organization. You do need the organization. You need the capabilities, the decision processes, the leadership team. You need all of that in place to help support the strategy. And as I've taken on bigger roles, and it does feel as if they are situations where the business needed both a clear strategic direction and an organization that could execute it. So, for instance, when I went to China with J&J Consumer, which is now Kenvue, the country's economy was on fire. I mean, things were seriously wrong if you were not growing double digits. And yet, this was a business that was actually declining. Employees who were demoralized by what was happening and certainly didn't want to continue to work for a company that they felt was on the downswing were leaving for the promise of promotions and heavy raises at other companies. And it was really a vicious cycle where what was needed was both a turnaround to right the ship and a longer term strategy that would triple the market share to be a top 10 player in a highly fragmented market. And of course, the organization to support that. So you needed the right people and the right capabilities to be able to pull that off. There had been grade inflation. So people had been promoted into roles that they really hadn't been appropriately developed for. And our team certainly wasn't up to the level of their peers in other J&J countries. So we started taking advantage of people's leaving to hire more skilled talent. And we began developing people with projects that allowed them to develop and showcase the skills and competencies that they needed to demonstrate. Or we implemented training programs to show our talent what great marketing was like. So I had to manage expectations and say, you're going to need to demonstrate the following skills and competencies and knowledge before you can move to the next level. And it meant really understanding the strengths and opportunities of our talent as a whole and as individuals to give them the sort of assignments that would help them to grow. If we were going to expand into new channels of marketing, we needed to think about talent development differently. How do you embed that expertise so that your whole marketing department is elevated and you don't end up with just a few specialists? And it's really sort of relevant to the question now about how you embed AI and data and analytics, not just as specialist skills in an organization, but so that your whole workforce has that level of competency to operate.
That's a great insight. When you think about the growth and impact that you've driven across these brands, what role has talent played and what have you learned about hiring and team building along the way?
So I think you have to start with the consumer or the customer at the fore, depending on whether or not you're B2B or even B2B2C, and not just how they use your category, but about what their life is like overall and how your product fits into their life overall. So you have to look at the broader landscape and ask, what are the changes in a consumer's life that could impact the role that your product plays in their life? And then if I think about hiring top performers, building high performance teams to address that, I mentioned before the advice that I'd gotten from a former boss about getting to know your team. And while I don't know that it necessarily changed how I hire, it did change the way I started to think about developing people and about giving them assignments that could continue to stretch them and keep them motivated. So, for example, I came to Walgreens to head up their private label business with a strategy to make store brands more like national brands, not competing on price, but truly trying to deliver real value. So this was about essentially shifting the organization from being people who were just doing a rotation in between merchandising or supply, sourcing roles, and basically creating a brand management system within the retailer. So when I started, someone that I didn't report to, but again was more senior to me, told me that if I didn't fire the whole department and start from scratch, I probably wouldn't be able to deliver on
Wow.
the brief. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's a bit harsh and incredibly impractical. And I think it also didn't give enough credit to the team in terms of their ability to learn.
Hmm.
And, I sat down with my direct reports and I said, we're going to need to change the way we're organized to reflect more of a brand management structure. And as I got to know the team, again, meeting with everybody individually, I got a sense of who would be able to make that leap from merchant or sourcing to brand development and commercialization. It's who's curious by what drives shoppers and consumers. And it's who has the learning agility to learn new skill sets and who has the right mindset to make the leap from one way of working to another and be excited about it. And so some people we moved out of the team into other groups, or if necessary, only one or two out of the organization over the next few months. And the remaining folks, we provided formal and informal training on consumer insight, brand positioning. How do you reflect that in packaging and in all your communications channels? How do you think about pricing? How do you think about promotion? How do you think about innovation? And we embedded new processes. We implemented S&OP to help manage our forecasting. We implemented StageGate to manage the innovation process. You know, we ran the risk that people were going to say, I don't want to learn this. That's too much. I was perfectly happy what I was doing before, but happily, it really energized people and it really motivated them. Some of whom came back and said, "Great, how do I get some special projects so that I continue to stretch my knowledge and skills in this area?" So it really was actually very positive. It was positive for the team. It was certainly positive for our engagement, and it really reflected well in our results.
I think in order to do that, you really just have to be clear about how the bar is being raised and what the expectations are and have the goal really dialed in and focused for the team.
That's exactly it, right? And you see who sparks to that,
Hmm.
right? And who is resistant to it.
Right.
And the folks that are resistant to it, maybe there's another place in the organization for them, or maybe we're no longer the place for them. And you give them time to go off and find the right thing instead.
You talked a little bit about some of the consumer changes, and you've led through cycles of massive change. What are one or two tips for navigating this ever changing market dynamics or shifting consumer behaviors or intense competition, just based on your experience?
Yeah, I think it comes back to curiosity and learning agility in terms of navigating those changes. And you can usually suss this out as you're talking to people, either existing employees or when you're hiring somebody. Are they curious? Where are shifts that they've had to make in their career, right? What sort of curveballs that have crossed their experience where, again, they've been able to pivot and they've done it in a positive way and are happy for the shift. And it very quickly becomes evident when people aren't comfortable in that. And again, there are places for people who are okay with that, but they may not necessarily be right for an organization, particularly the organizations or the assignments that I've had where you are in the middle of a transformation or a turnaround, and you do need for people to think differently, approach differently, and really think about the consumer and the marketplace and their own brand differently.
A lot of people ask me, what exactly do you do at Noto Group? We partner with entrepreneurs, founders, executives, investors, and boards to help them build high performance leadership teams that excel and endure. We've had the privilege of working with more than 250 leading brands, from early stage innovators to global icons, and we've placed hundreds of executives along the way. As a certified B Corp since 2013 and proud 1% for the Planet member, it always starts with your mission and values and finding leaders who can bring those to life. If you're curious, you can find out more by visiting our website, notogroup.com. Thanks, and now let's get back to our episode. So, how did you develop your aptitude for hiring top performers and building high performance teams? Were there mentors or moments that shaped your knowledge or approach to that?
Yeah, in a lot of the cases, certainly more recently where I've been interviewing somebody, usually they've been vetted against a brief that I have signed off on, usually by an internal or an external recruiter and by at least one other person on my team. So I go in assuming that people have the intellectual horsepower and can do the job. But usually what I'm looking for is fit. Because in any organization I've worked in, getting things done requires working cross functionally and usually with internal and external agencies. And you're unlikely to be able to do that if you're pissing people off. But because I've also worked so much in transformations or where there is a shift needed, I'm usually also looking for people who can nudge the organization in that direction. And those are the people who need to be emotionally intelligent enough to be able to navigate so that it is clear that they are there to learn from others as they are to embed a new way of working. It's usually about, okay, how do we start to make that shift and how do we bring people along? And as I said, usually people who are coming in from the outside who do bring a different skill set or a different sort of mental model need to understand that it's as much imperative on them to learn from others and to learn the environment, which is usually new for them as well. So, a lot of it is intuition, which is really just shorthand for experience and identifying patterns that you've seen work or not work. I know that when I interview someone, I am thinking about whether or not they'll be successful in the role that they're interviewing for given what I know about the organization and listening to what they've achieved in the past and how they've achieved it. But I also think about whether or not there's somebody that I could see working at the next level in the organization or even the level beyond that. And I think about whether or not there's somebody that I would want to work for. So, something that I've seen work to good effect has been ensure that others who will be working directly with the person cross functionally get a chance to meet with top candidates because it not only gives the candidates an opportunity to get a broader perspective on the company, but it also helps get buy-in and ownership on the hire, which really does then set the new hire up for success when they come in.
That's great. So what stands out to you when you think about the different ways that Unilever, J&J, and Walgreens approached hiring and talent around recruitment or selection, development, succession planning? Is there anything that stands out or that you can compare and contrast between those organizations?
Yeah, Unilever and J&J were very similar because they did have brand management. The organizations were structured very similarly. So, usually you were being brought in by a recruiter and you were being fully briefed. You had been vetted before you came in. You knew who you were meeting with. Walgreens was less similar. The organization certainly was structured much, much differently. The backgrounds of the people that I were meeting was very different. So the Unilevers and the J&Js of the world tend to hire from similar companies, even when they're recruiting at the junior levels, they're going to a select set of business schools or colleges. Walgreens, not so much. So you weren't comparing education. It really didn't matter where you had gone to school. What really mattered was what you had achieved and would you be a fit. It was more about the impact that they had had on companies and more about could you see the transferability of their skills and competencies from what they had been doing to what they would be doing. And a lot of it was again, the mental attitude, a mental model of, do you have that learning agility? Are you looking to learn something new? Are you curious about how consumers work, how customers work, how retail works? And are you excited about that? As opposed to, am I sort of imposing something that you'd really rather not have happen?
Yeah. So, what do you look for when you're hiring for your own leadership team in these different roles you've had?
So we talked earlier about, core values and beliefs, and I do look for a lot of that in my direct reports. So integrity has to be there in my direct reports, in my whole team. Servant leadership, it really can't be about them. I want to see examples of how they've cared for their direct reports and their direct teams, and they've developed them and they've supported them, and how they've been good partners to their cross-functional teams. I think about how they interact with the rest of the leadership team. So, are they someone who is looking to help and lift up the whole team? Can they pitch in? Are they can do? Okay, not blindly so, but do they have the confidence in their ability to figure things out, to be creative, to problem solve? Have they demonstrated that? They need to demonstrate credibility. I look for initiative and ownership of the work that they've done because, again, I believe in empowerment. I want to be able to empower them and hold them accountable so that I can recognize them for their contribution. And I like ambition. People who want to continue to learn and want to get to the next level by seeing opportunities and pursuing them and contributing and stretching. There's nothing wrong with saying, I want to move up the ladder and I'm willing to learn and work and, put in the energy that it's going to take. I think that it's really a mindset of, I want to continue to learn and stretch, and I'm going to pursue those special assignments. And, I'm seeing opportunities. Can I pursue that project? Or I'm sort of intrigued by this insight over here. Would you mind if I sort of, spent a little bit more time on that? I think that's great. I think that there are ways of aligning people, and I think the best way to do it is to get iterative buy in and let people feel as if they are part of the solution so that they own it when it launches.
100%. That's awesome. So I've known you for a while, and we've talked about your career, different stages. And when you were at J&J in China, you were brought in to lead a turnaround. So I wanted to ask you what your first move was walking into that role. How did you approach that? That must have been pretty daunting to move to China and take on a role like that.
It was. I remember after I accepted thinking, wow, what have I done? And at the time, I thought the decision is really to stay in the US, continuing to do what I do, or go abroad and have this hopefully amazing adventure. It could go south, but either way, it will have been a stretching opportunity. It will be an opportunity to learn a new market. And I had done some global marketing, but again, from the safety of Connecticut or New Jersey, I'd certainly never been on the ground working day to day in another country. And certainly not one where I didn't speak or read the language. And we've talked about how people were leaving because people didn't really want to continue to work for a company that wasn't succeeding when there were so many companies around them that were. The challenge was really twofold because one was, how do you get the business quickly back on track, as well as how do you develop a long-term strategy for the future that will ensure its sustainability. And so, we've talked about coming in and getting to know the team, your own team cross-functionally, building those relationships, which I think immediately helps to build trust. It also helps to identify the easy wins and get a sense of where the obstacles are going to be, both outside the company in terms of what you need to be addressing with retailers, with consumers, with customers, with other partners, but also internally. So, where do people hold sort of some long held beliefs, and what might they be resistant to as you make changes going down the line? I do think keeping people in the loop and building co ownership really helps. When I went to China, as I said, there was certainly some short-term things that needed to happen, and we put those into place, whether that meant making some very hard choices. It also meant not only looking at what strengths and opportunities we had within the China business, but also what did we have globally that we could leverage. For the long-term strategy, I was working with a consultant, and we debated and challenged each other a lot, right? So what the goal ought to be, where we should be focusing our attention. I mean, there's so many directions you can go in. What would it take to succeed? Where we thought we needed to build capacity to win? What capacity do we have that we could leverage? So this does get back to your question about how do you build that buy-in and how do you align people is once we had a straw man, I did the rounds in one-on-ones with the cross-functional leadership team to get their input and sort of pressure test where they thought the weaknesses or gaps would be and what they would need for their own teams to be able to deliver if we in fact adopted this strategy. And so we continued to build the strategy iteratively based on that feedback until we had something that everybody could stand behind and then felt comfortable cascading it, communicating it to their teams.
If you were to think about the cultural differences, high context versus low context type culture stuff, whether it was with the consumer who you were trying to speak to and connect with, or the team, were there any interesting things or differences that you had to kind of adapt your own thinking around?
Well, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of consumer research. Certainly for our ongoing business, whether that was advertising or new products, I sat in on focus groups. So I was watching the consumer speak and I was hearing a translator through my headphones. So, certainly getting a sense of the consumer. There are a lot of dynamics that are similar, right? So, everybody wants the best for their family. Everybody loves their baby and wants the best and wants their child to develop well. Certainly in China, in a one child environment, the pressure was that much greater. And it actually was something that affected both talent as well as the consumers we were servicing, which means that for babies, everybody is focused on their development, what is best for brain development, what will help them be most successful in life, even as they are not yet walking. So it affects not only the consumers that you are serving, whether these are the baby market and new parents who want the best for their child, and how do you help set them up to do that, as well as skincare ranges that we had. We had a local brand called Dabao that we targeted towards young career people who had left the rural areas, moved to the big city, and really leveraged the fact that they were in a new environment themselves, not only in a new work environment from college, but also they were away from family. And it's easy to get homesick when you're away from family. Because the brand had such heritage, it was a local brand that people had grown up with, tying this brand that we were on the one hand rebranding to be more modern, but also harkening back to this is a brand that has been tried and trusted. As you've grown up, you've seen your whole family use it. It's a mainstay in your home. That sort of heritage and that comfort and that reminiscence, that link back to home and your family was really powerful. So again, you do find that there are some dynamics that are consistent across markets, but there are specifics that are particular to the local market. And so certainly it played out there. In terms of how it played out in talent, so you've got all of these sort of, young mid-20s who come to the office and they come in with this pressure to live up to certain expectations. And so I did have people who came into my office and would say, "I've been here 3 years. I am deserving of a promotion." And you say, "Well, tell me more about what you've done." And they'd go, "I've been here for 3 years. I am deserving of a promotion." But you do find that there are dynamics that are specific to markets, that everybody has the same sort of meta trends, but those specifics are particular to markets, and you need to understand them and work with them.
So, if you were talking to somebody who's right out of college or early in their career, do you have any advice or things that you would like to share or that you wished somebody had shared with you early in your career?
Yeah, I think confidence is a big one. I was probably not confident enough, and I think I held myself back in terms of what I thought I could do. And having had bosses who did express confidence in me helped me tremendously. And so I would say if you don't get that kind of boss, I think you need to have the confidence in yourself to ask for projects, ask for stretching opportunities, ask to be on things that raise your profile within the company, to be on committees where other people get to know you, you get to know other people. That is probably a mistake that I made earlier in my career is that I stayed very close to sort of marketing home and didn't get to know the rest of the organization as well, nor let the rest of the organization get to know me as well. And I think that plays into, I hate to say politics, but I do think that there is something about really understanding that It is not just if you work really hard and do really good work that you will be recognized for it. And I'm not saying necessarily be an obnoxious self promoter, but do find ways or ask your boss to help you find ways to amplify, highlight the work that you do. And as I said, look for opportunities where you can showcase your skills and your capabilities in broader forums outside of, say, the specific business or the specific brand that you work on if you're in a brand management context, that really do give you broader exposure, both for your own learning and your own networking, as well as your own visibility and moving up the ladder.
That's great. That's excellent advice. So, as you think about and reflect on what's ahead, what kind of challenge feels most energizing right now, and what's next for you?
Yeah, I think like other people, I think my priorities have changed in the last couple of years in response to both macro and micro forces. So I certainly have had changes in my own life where I've reevaluated and I've pivoted from full-time roles now to board service, both corporate and not for profit. And I'm looking to build on that. I also do what I'll call opportunistic consulting, where I'm not really pounding the pavement for it, but I'm happy to help when when it comes to me and where I think I can add value. But I've sat now on the boards of two private equity backed companies, one in contract manufacturing, one in mass beauty. And it's been really fulfilling to be able to bring the experience and the lessons that I've learned in my executive life to oversight and governance roles. I think a lot of us, we're so in our own heads and we assume that everybody else knows what we know. And it's really nice to come to a new environment where you find that actually, your critical thinking, your constructive thinking, you're able to bring that to another company's trajectory and ask the questions that will uncover opportunities and risks. And, I've built my career helping companies, big companies like Unilever and J&J and Walgreens, and smaller ones like the ones that I've worked with in private equity, both in branded and private label businesses, where it's a matter of how do we reset the performance when growth stalls. And I think it's that marriage of shaping portfolio strategy and building the organizational capability to execute it that is what delivers sustainable growth. And that's what I'd like to do more of.
Helayna, I appreciate you coming onto the podcast. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for quite some time, and it's just been super fun to get a view into your world and your experience and how you think about leadership and hiring and building teams. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I mean, I enjoy our conversations one-on-one, but this has been a terrific opportunity and just great chatting with you about my background and some of the lessons I've learned along the way.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in to How I Hire. Visit howihire.com for details about the show. How I Hire is created by Noda Group Executive Search. To find out more about us, visit nodagroup.com. You can also sign up for our monthly email job alert newsletter there and find additional job search strategy resources as well as more content on hiring. This podcast was produced by Anna McLean. To learn more about her and her team's work, visit aomclean.com.